Hey everybody, this is Brian.
And this is Josh.
Welcome to the podcast for Curiosity Continuum.
Curiosity Continuum is an industry-innovating, non-traditional company passionate about growing wisdom in the next generation.
We are the essential bridge between the analog and digital worlds by building collaborative communities that unleash the power of adaptive expertise and innovation needed to thrive in the 21st century.
We combine and mix essential elements needed to empower people to succeed in new ways, not possible outside of a creative, thoughtful, diverse community of fellow curious people.
Follow us on your favorite podcast app to receive notifications of new content. If you like what you hear and want to dive deeper, visit us at curiositycontinuum.com. Thanks for tuning in. Let's start the conversation.
All right, Brian. So we were starting to talk about in the last episode, we said, well, maybe these will be kind of a series of episodes. We'll probably kind of butt them together. Maybe we might mix them up, jumble them up a little bit. But because this topics, well, really it's topics. I think in that first episode, we really kind of unpacked a few things that were kind of important because we started off talking about, just recap real quick, kind of like movement of your life. So Brian kind of tried to use like music as an example. I was just more like, well, the big inflection points change the movement of your life, right? Like where you go and are you happy where you're at? And if you're not, how do you kind of move, right? To get to where you want to be. So is that kind of a good like 30-second primer there, Brian?
Great. Great. Previously on Curiosity Continuum.
Yeah. Yeah. Adults with busy lives section. Yep.
Part 1700. When I think about one of the last comments I made was like, ignorance is bliss. And you said, yes, I knew some people like that. So this episode may be about happiness and awareness. Here's a great thing. I have a wonderful friend named Jonathan, and he is very different than me. One time I was on a gig with him, and we were talking about the details. One of the reasons why he loved carrying me along on gigs is because A, I played bass, and B, I also was kind of like the administrative enough guy to be able to make sure everybody got to where they needed to go. And he was not the administrative guy, so
you were the responsible adult. Yeah.
I was the twofer in that whole deal.
Yeah.
I didn't get paid twofer, but that was a twofer. He said to me one time that it made a lot of sense to me. He said, Brian, when I would go travel with other people, he said, I make sure people know to tell me, like, where do I need to be? What time I'm leaving, all that kind of stuff. He goes, honestly, I'm not like terribly detail-oriented. I'm not that curious. And he said it in like the kindest, nicest way. I'm going like that. Absolutely
God bless him.
Makes sense. But that absolutely makes sense. Like, why? Like, it doesn't occur to you because you're not wired that way. For me, I think I'm always attuned to like saying, here's all the possibilities of what it could be or how it could go wrong or what if this is right. And I'm playing all those scenarios. And he was very present. One thing that I really admire about him is that when he's in a moment, he's in a moment. He's there.
Yeah.
I really struggle to be in that moment. And let's turn the term ignorance. It doesn't mean like, you're stupid, right? Ignorance is just like,
not
you
at
don't
all.
know.
It's just not aware. My grandmother was that way. One of my grandmothers, like we almost call it naivete sometimes. You're naive in a way. It's just, you're just not aware. And not of everything, just of certain things. Like there might be like this thing that just doesn't bother you. Like some people do not have the time. Like time is like their thing. Like I think Brian and I are kind of that way. Like we do try to be on time to things. We try to have a structure of some kind. There are some people that just don't care and they live their life like that. Now it's hard. I mean, one of the people I work with, she rolls into work. We always call it fashionably late. It's always like 10 minutes after we're all started working. And we're like, we do start at a certain time today. Right? And there she's like, yeah, we always plan her on being 5, 10, 15 minutes late. And she's been talked to by people that just doesn't care. It does not bother her. And so after so many years, they just kind of gave up and they just kind of let her be her. But she's a great employee. But it's just that's just a start time thing. That it's just not, and doesn't bother her one bit.
My wife went to Africa years ago, and she said African time will blow up any Western idea of time that you have. It'll start 2 hours late. And sometimes it's because the people coming to see you, they see a friend on the street, and they're like, hello, how are you? How is your family? Tell us about your animals. Are they good too? And that's how they roll.
Yeah.
And I think every American sensibility in me just like says does not compute, and I get itchy just thinking about that reality. But how are you able to be happy as easily if you try to know all the things? So we usually ignorance is bliss can be applied in a sense of like, hey, like I don't know, I'm happy. But I think sometimes when you know better, it's harder for you, at least for me, to be happy in that moment. Like
Yeah. What kind of plays on your anxieties too? Like, so because I think when you're
yeah,
aware
let's
of
talk
things
about
that can happen, anxiety takes over. If you're not aware it can happen, how can you be anxious about it? Right. And I do think that I've struggled with anxiety. We've talked about that. Like I've struggled with it. Like I'll wake up in this anxious fervor state. But like by this point of the night, and we're recording in the evening, I actually feel probably the most normal I feel all day. And I don't really want to go to bed. I don't really, because then I know I just start that whole thing over. But it's all my
Sure.
mind just kind of racing, right? So if I can put away some of that, I would. If I could just like not have that, I would. But I think that's more for my everyday routine. But I know what you're saying too with some of those people, like they just don't know that's a possibility that could happen. So they don't worry about it. And how can you be anxious about it? And that's a good thing, I think, in a way. Now, if it could be dangerous for some things, but I don't see a harm in it, really.
So should we strive to be, it's going to sound funny, should we strive to be ignorant if we want to be happy?
I don't think so. I think it's important to be aware of what can happen, like possibilities of things. I think it's important. It's also how I believe how we would actually like kind of evolve as a society, right? We have to you can't just not care. You have to be kind of like you have to be in the moment. But what I think it is being aware, and then you have to just shut that part off of the thinking about the future part a little bit. Sometimes you have to just be in that moment with people and who you're around and what you're doing at the time. If you're conversing on the telephone, you shouldn't be like watching something on TV. You shouldn't be doing like 5 things in your car when you're driving. Like we see all these people, they're eating, they're listening to a podcast, and they're driving. Really? Are you doing all those things? Are you doing any of them really well? And I think that's what it kind of boils down to. Do you really want to be like that person that does like 10 things and is anxious about all of them? Or do you want to just be kind of that person that does like 3 things really well and is not really anxious about it because you can do those 3 things? And I think that's where the happiness would come in, because you're confident that you could do those 3 things or 5 things or whatever it is that you really want to focus on. And I've seen this in some people's professional lives. Like I have talked to people who, for example, I'll use gaming as an example. Like they are a number 1 podcaster in gaming, for example, one of the number 1 podcasters in gaming. And they don't diversify their knowledge purposefully because they literally say, you don't want me to know a little about a lot. I will know a lot about one thing really well.
There was a counselor who had a doctorate, and he used a phrase with me which you said the exact thing he said, just in a different context and a little bit different way. He said, when you have a doctorate, you know a lot about a little. He said, and that's why it's like a super specialty. It's because you have purposely not given, like, you're not trying to understand everything. You understand this one thing really well. And you know what? Sometimes people understand that because as human beings, even if you have like one thing you're good at, there's other things that you do to support that. So it's how you learn, for example. It's how you, figure out or navigate in a place or something like that, right? Like there's other supporting skill sets that are manifest for that specialty. Here's a great example. I started the Upstairs Whiskey Club before pandemic happened. And this was an invite-only thing. I started with 5 guys, and I told them, I said, yo, you're in the club. It started out as men only, and then we opened it up to women. And I said, okay, if you came tonight, you're in the club. The only way somebody else gets in this club is if you invite them. Now, Josh has been out to one of these things in the later outworkings of it and stuff like that. What's interesting is that most people who came to the whiskey night also liked other things like tequila or wine or beer, right? And they said, have you ever considered doing that? I go, yeah. But this was honestly one of the first times where I super specialized. Now, at that particular moment, I was only really familiar with American whiskeys. And really, there was a lot of bourbon that I was aware of more than anything. But I could talk about it a lot. And people still to this day say, hey, you got a good recommendation for X. It's because I can tell them. But they're not asking my advice on every other thing. But it built the community around something, even though people have other interests than that. It's
Right.
that specific thing. So I'm going to just go back and think about it. Was I curious about any other one? I mean, I guess, but not enough to go explore it. And I was happy enough to be in that moment enjoying that thing. Like I didn't feel the need to have to educate myself because I wasn't trying to be a bartender and I wasn't trying to be a beverage distributor or anything. I just wanted to enjoy fun things with people and just explore something in a category. And that really brought a lot of joy to me. So maybe it's finding joy in the things where, like you said, you're good at it or you enjoy it and appreciate it and having that be sufficient. I think I always hated the word sufficient because it meant you're not doing enough. But that's my chronic overachiever.
Yeah, or you're good enough. And I do believe that was something I had to really kind of come to grasps with. And I did it kind of earlier in my life a little bit, but then kind of like trailed off and then kind of come back a little bit with it. And I use gaming as an example because it's a big part of my hobbies. When we have this term in gaming, backlog, right? It's games that you want to play, but you haven't played yet. You don't have time for it. I came to this conclusion because it's anxiety driven. Like you're like, I got to beat all these games. I got to play them at least so I can be in the conversation, the quote unquote conversation. There has to come a time when you just have to say, I got to let it go. And I can't do it all. And I think that is something where I think, especially when like Brian and I were young, like our church helped us with that, right? Like you would go, your faith kind of helped you with that you don't do it all. You have someone, you have faith that you have higher powers and things like that will help you along the way. And I think that's maybe what a lot of people are kind of lacking today, because when you take that away, you're going to try to find something to fill that void, right? Even if you don't know it, you're going to try to find something to fill that, like make something else. So you're trying to do it all, and you just have to realize you can't. And like, for example, with the backlog thing, I just let it go. I'm like, if I get to those games, I get to them. And sometimes it's like a year later and I'm looking at my gaming shelf and I'm going, oh yeah, I'll try that. And I'm like, this was in my backlog. And I'm like, I was kind of like laugh about it now. And I'll put the game in and then here's where the anxiety part of being a gamer is. You put that game in and it's not good. And you're like, wow, I got to play this though, because I'm missing out on it. Then you just got to learn to let it go too. You got to say, okay, put it back. Mm-hmm. And maybe you'll come back to it another time. Maybe you won't. But not knowing is okay, because you're focusing your stuff on what is important to you. And I think you only have so much time to do it.
I would maybe leave with some summarized thoughts with it. One is anxiety is never the fuel that you want to fuel your curiosity.
No, because anxiety is also, number one, it leads to problems. It leads to anxiousness, which is not good, because you make mistakes when you're anxious. And I think that you do things for the wrong reason. You're doing it to appease the anxiety part. We should just learn not to have the anxiety in the first place by setting up your life in such a way, is what I'm trying to do with my life, is set up my daily routine and the things I do, where when stuff unexpected happens, I can handle it and it's not such a big deal.
I'm thinking about this as it kind of turn it to a positive action rather than saying like, don't be anxious. It would be focused and present.
Yeah.
Kind of in your moment at the things you're good at. There are things you can't control. And, that can bring peace. Like if you and I, for example, when we've recorded the podcast in the room together, am I concerned about what else is happening somewhere else? It's like, no, I'll find out if I needed to, right? Like if my house was burning down,
you'd find out.
I'll figure it out. Yeah, I'll find out one way or another. I'm going to find out. But, these times, Josh, over the course of years, has been a time where I know I need to show up in a certain way. There's a little bit of like prep on the tech side and stuff. And then usually we have like the palate cleanser conversation and stuff, but there's a rhythm to it that has really been a good anchor point to kind of just do one thing at a time and just appreciate it.
Yeah. And I think when it's important, like for example, like the podcast, when we're doing this, we have a day and time that we meet. And we pretty much meet on that day and time every week or whenever we schedule it to actually do it. We try to do it once a week, and we really do move mountains to kind of do that. Like if I'm not feeling well or Brian's not feeling well, we'll still do it. We might push it off 10 or 15 minutes because I got to get something to eat or whatever like that. But the anchor point is there. And so, yeah, it has a little chain attached to it and we can kind of pull it one way or the other, but we're still there. And so I think it's also there for each other. So like if you think about that, you shouldn't be in this stuff alone, like that's where anxiety comes from too. If you're trying to do it all by yourself, like Brian and I are both married, our wives are anchor points for us. Like they tell us, hey, maybe you're getting a little nuts with this. Maybe you need to, why don't you go relax? Why don't you go, and then maybe we might just have a conversation about something. And it's not like my wife is just there for me, right? I mean, she's got her own life. She's doing her things too. But we're there for each other when we need it. And sometimes, like friends are that way too. Like you should have a friend that you can talk to and there when you need him or her. And I think that's important. And that will allow you to be present too, because you're like, I'm not so worried about every little thing.
So what anchors you is the question I think I want to leave people with. What anchors you?
Yeah.
And there's ways to explore it. Is that the thing causing you the anxiety? Is that the thing that alleviates your anxiety?
I think it's a good place. Yeah, let's put a comma.
Till next time, this is Brian.
And this is Josh.
For Curiosity Continuum.